the zone of silence, where communication and compasses fail. In the Mapimi Desert in northern Mexico, in the desolate borderlands where Durango, Chihuahua, and Coahuila meet, there exists a roughly 50-kilometer area called La Zona del Silencio, the zone of silence, where radio signals allegedly don't transmit, where compasses spin uselessly, where electromagnetic phenomena behave in ways that violate normal physics, where communication equipment fails consistently and inexplicably, where the laws governing radio propagation and magnetic fields seem to be suspended or altered by forces or conditions that science hasn't adequately explained despite decades of investigation and speculation. The zone gained international attention in 1970 when an American Athena test rocket launched from Green Sands Missile Base in Utah went dramatically off course and crashed in the area. A guidance failure that required U.S. military personnel to cross into Mexico to retrieve the rocket and its payload, an incident that brought American scientists and engineers face to face with the zone's reputation and allegedly with its anomalous properties, leading to investigations that supposedly confirmed something unusual about the location, while also generating conspiracy theories about what the military really found there, what they might have been testing, whether the rocket failure was accident, or whether the zone itself somehow pulled the missile off course through mechanisms that conventional physics doesn't describe. Local ranchers and residents have known about the area for generations, reporting that radios don't work, that compasses become unreliable, that the zone is cursed or haunted or touched by something that makes it different from surrounding desert, that animals behave strangely there, that lights appear in the sky with unusual frequency, that time itself feels distorted when you're in the zone's center, that people have gotten lost despite the terrain being flat and navigable, disoriented by the failure of their equipment and by something about the space that makes direction and distance ambiguous. Scientists who've studied the zone point to geological factors: high concentrations of magnetic minerals in the soil, unusual rock formations that might affect radio propagation, the area's location at roughly the same latitude as the Bermuda Triangle and Egyptian pyramids, creating what some call an energy belt around the planet where anomalies cluster. Though this last claim ventures into pseudoscience that mainstream researchers reject. But the explanations feel incomplete, feel like they're describing symptoms rather than causes, accounting for some observations while leaving others unexplained, leaving the zone of silence hovering between explicable geological anomaly and genuinely mysterious location, where the normal rules don't quite apply, where something about the specific configuration of matter and energy creates conditions that aren't supposed to exist according to conventional understanding of how electromagnetic radiation propagates and how magnetic fields function, making it either fascinating case study in unusual but ultimately comprehensible geological and atmospheric conditions, or genuine anomaly that suggests our physics is incomplete, that there are effects and interactions we haven't cataloged, that locations can exist where reality works differently, not because supernatural forces are present, but because natural forces interact in ways we haven't observed elsewhere, and that we don't have adequate theories to explain, leaving the zone of silence as it has been since people first noticed its strangeness, a place where communication fails, where navigation becomes uncertain, where the technological systems we rely on stop functioning reliably, where you're forced to confront how dependent you've become on electromagnetic radiation for information and connection and orientation, and what it means when that medium stops working, when the invisible infrastructure of radio and magnetism that we navigate by simply isn't there or doesn't function properly, leaving you in silence, in isolation, in disorientation that's spatial and technological, and perhaps something else, something about the zone that affects consciousness or perception in ways that transcend mere equipment failure, that makes the space feel wrong in addition to being technically anomalous. That transforms a patch of desert into something that locals avoid and that visitors find disturbing, not because of danger in conventional sense, but because of the profound wrongness of a place where fundamental things we take for granted. The ability to communicate, to navigate, to orient ourselves through instruments we trust, simply stop working without clear reason, without adequate explanation, without the comfort of understanding why this place is different, why it's silent, why it's strange. The historical accounts of the zone predate modern technology, with local indigenous peoples and early Spanish colonizers, noting that the area had unusual characteristics, that animals avoided it, that travelers reported disorientation, that it had a reputation as a place of mystery long before radios and compasses existed to fail there. This suggests that whatever makes the zone anomalous isn't purely about modern electromagnetic technology, but involves properties that humans have perceived across centuries, effects that manifested in different ways depending on the technology available, as spiritual wrongness in pre-technological eras, as navigational difficulty in the age of exploration, as communication failure in the radio age, as whatever the zone will disrupt in future technologies we develop. The 1970 Athena rocket incident is well-documented fact, not legend. An Athena missile launched from Utah, carrying cobalt-57 canisters for atmospheric testing, went wildly off course and crashed in the Mapimi Desert, requiring a joint US-Mexican recovery operation to retrieve the radioactive payload. The official explanation cites guidance system failure, but the fact that the missile crashed specifically in the zone of silence, hundreds of miles from its intended trajectory, sparked immediate speculation that the zone itself had somehow affected the rocket, had pulled it off course through anomalous magnetic or electromagnetic fields, had demonstrated that its effects could reach into the sky, could affect objects in flight, making it not just surface phenomenon, but volumetric anomaly extending upward into the atmosphere. The subsequent US Air Force investigation of the area allegedly found unusual magnetic readings, confirmed difficulties with radio communication, and noted the high concentration of magnetic minerals in the soil, including magnetite and other iron-rich materials that could theoretically affect magnetic compasses and might affect radio propagation under certain conditions. But the official reports, if they still exist in accessible form, don't claim the zone represents physics. Defying anomaly, just unusual geological conditions that create predictable effects on electromagnetic equipment. The gap between this measured conclusion and the dramatic claims about the zone's properties represents the space where legend amplifies reality, where unusual becomes impossible, where difficult radio transmission becomes absolute silence. The geological explanation focuses on the Cretaceous rock formations underlying the area, which contain high concentrations of magnetic minerals that accumulated through ancient volcanic activity and sedimentation processes. These minerals create localized variations in Earth's magnetic field that would make compass readings unreliable, particularly if the user doesn't know to account for these variations. The same minerals could theoretically affect radio propagation by absorbing or reflecting certain frequencies, creating dead zones where transmission is attenuated, though not completely blocked. This accounts for the zone's characteristics within known physics, makes it unusual but not anomalous, interesting but not impossible. But this explanation struggles with several observations. Radio communication doesn't fail completely in the zone. It becomes unreliable and difficult, which is different from the absolute silence that the name suggests and that some accounts describe. Modern GPS systems, which rely on satellite communication rather than ground-based radio, function normally in the zone, suggesting that whatever interference exists is frequency-specific rather than universal electromagnetic disruption. And compasses, while affected by local magnetic variations, still function. They just point to local magnetic north rather than true north, which is annoying but not mysterious if you understand that magnetic compasses respond to local field conditions rather than to some universal directional reference. The meteorite claims add another dimension. Some researchers note that the zone of silence has unusually high meteorite fall frequency, with more meteorites recovered from the area than would be statistically expected for its size. This has generated theories about unusual gravitational or magnetic properties that might attract or pull meteorites toward the zone, though conventional physics doesn't support mechanisms by which surface magnetic fields could affect meteorite trajectories significantly enough to create concentration effects. Alternative explanations suggest that the meteorite concentration is observational artifact, the flat, open terrain, and the presence of researchers specifically looking for anomalies means meteorites that fall. There are more likely to be noticed and recovered than meteorites that fall in more vegetated or less scrutinized areas. The biological anomalies are more speculative. Claims about unusual plant mutations, animals born with defects, human visitors experiencing time distortions, or consciousness alterations. These enter territory where verification is difficult and where natural baseline variations in biology and psychology are easily interpreted as zone-specific effects by observers primed to find anomalies. The Athena rocket's Cobalt-57 payload means the crash site had radioactive contamination, which could cause biological effects. But this is localized to the impact site rather than being characteristic of the entire zone. The comparative latitude claims that the zone of silence sits at roughly the same latitude as the Bermuda Triangle and the Egyptian pyramids, suggesting a global belt of anomalies, represents numerology rather than science. While the latitudes are roughly similar, around 27 to 30 degrees north, this is coincidence rather than meaningful correlation. Millions of square kilometers exist at these latitudes, and selecting specific locations that have acquired mysterious reputations doesn't demonstrate that latitude itself is causally relevant. The energy belt concept lacks physical mechanism and cherry-picks locations, while ignoring the vast majority of territory at the same latitudes that shows no unusual characteristics. The UFO connection is inevitable given the zone's reputation. If compass and radio anomalies exist, if the area has unusual properties, then it becomes attractive location for UFO sightings and claims, creating feedback loop where the zone's reputation brings attention that generates more reports that reinforce the reputation. Whether UFO activity in the zone exceeds baseline rates for remote desert locations is difficult to determine because baseline rates are themselves uncertain, and because the definition of UFO activity is subjective. Unusual lights in the sky in remote areas are reported globally and have multiple explanations: atmospheric phenomena, aircraft, satellites, planets, human lighting, ball lightning, most of which have nothing to do with extraterrestrial craft. The government interest adds conspiracy dimension. The US military's presence to recover the Athena rocket, combined with the zone's proximity to what was once a military testing area and to the US-Mexico border, creates speculation that the zone serves military purposes, that its anomalous properties are being studied or exploited, that facilities exist underground, or that the area is monitored for reasons that aren't acknowledged publicly. The fact that some investigations occurred doesn't prove ongoing classified interest, but the lack of transparency around what those investigations found creates space for speculation that can't be disproven without access to potentially classified information. The tourism industry that's developed around the zone demonstrates how anomalies become commercialized. Tour operators offer expeditions to experience the zone's silence, to test communications equipment, to search for meteorites, to visit locations where unusual events allegedly occurred. This creates incentive to maintain and amplify the mystery, to emphasize the unexplained aspects while downplaying the mundane explanations, to tell tourist stories that make the zone seem more dramatic than geological surveys would suggest. The commercialization doesn't prove the zone isn't anomalous, but it does mean that accounts must be evaluated carefully for potential exaggeration motivated by tourism revenue. The time distortion claims are particularly difficult to evaluate. People report that time seems to pass differently in the zone, that hours feel like minutes, or vice versa, that watches malfunction or run at incorrect rates. These could be psychological effects. Isolation in featureless terrain creates altered time perception, expectation of temporal anomalies, creates suggestion effects that manifest as perceived distortions. Or they could represent real chronometric effects if the zone somehow affects local space-time geometry, though this would require gravitational anomalies or exotic physics that have no other evidence, and that seem implausibly dramatic for effects attributed to geological conditions alone. The question of replication is central to evaluating the zone scientifically. Have controlled experiments with standardized equipment documented the claimed effects under conditions that eliminate confounds? Has anyone conducted systematic survey with multiple compass readings at precisely documented locations to map the magnetic field variations? Has radio propagation been tested across multiple frequencies with proper controls to distinguish between signal attenuation and complete failure? Without this kind of rigorous documentation, we're left with anecdotal reports that could reflect real effects, could reflect equipment malfunction, could reflect user error, or could reflect expectations creating interpretations where technical difficulties in challenging terrain become mysterious zone effects. The psychological component is significant regardless of physical anomalies. A location that has reputation for strangeness will feel strange to visitors who know the reputation. Expectation creates hypervigilance. You notice every technical glitch, every moment of disorientation, every unusual perception, and attribute it to the zone's effects, rather than to the normal variabilities that occur everywhere, but that we don't attend to or find significant in locations that lack mysterious reputations. This doesn't mean the zone isn't unusual, but it does mean that subjective reports of strangeness must be interpreted cautiously, distinguished from objectively measurable anomalies that persist regardless of observer expectations. The indigenous perspectives deserve consideration. Local peoples who lived in the region for centuries before modern technology reported that the area was different, was to be avoided or approached with caution, had qualities that made it unsuitable for habitation or certain activities. This traditional knowledge might reflect accumulated observations of real effects. The difficult terrain, the lack of water, the magnetic variations affecting navigation, even in pre-compass eras, through subtle cues that experienced travelers detected. Or it might reflect spiritual or cultural beliefs that attributed significance to the area for reasons unrelated to physical properties, creating sacred or forbidden zones that were marked by restrictions, regardless of whether measurable anomalies existed. Whether the zone of silence represents genuine anomaly requiring new physics to explain, represents well-understood geological conditions that produce unusual but explicable effects on electromagnetic systems, or represents mostly reputation and suggestion with minimal objective basis beyond difficult terrain and localized magnetic variations, depends on which evidence you weight most heavily, which reports you trust, which explanations you find satisfying. The zone exists. It's a real place you can visit. The question is whether what you experience there reflects properties that are scientifically anomalous or reflects the interaction of known physics, challenging terrain, technical limitations of equipment, and psychological effects of expectation in a location that has acquired legendary status. The practical implications, if the zone's effects are real and reproducible, would be significant. Understanding what creates the interference could lead to development of countermeasures, could inform communication system design, could reveal physics that has applications beyond the specific zone. If the effects are strong enough to disrupt military rocket guidance systems, as the Athena incident suggests, then weaponization becomes possibility, creating artificial zones of silence that disable enemy communications, that create navigational confusion, that provide tactical advantages. The lack of obvious military exploitation of these effects, assuming they're real and controllable, suggests either that they're not as dramatic as legends claim, or that classification prevents us from knowing how they're being used. The zone of silence endures as modern mystery, as place that captures imagination because it represents boundary. Boundary between known and unknown, between reliable and unreliable, between connected and isolated, between orientated and lost. In age of ubiquitous communication, of GPS navigation, of electromagnetic systems that we depend on without thinking about them, a place where these systems fail or become uncertain is fundamentally disorienting, is a reminder of how much we've delegated to technology and how helpless we are when that technology stops working, when silence isn't choice but is imposed by environment, when navigation isn't automatic but requires dead reckoning and instinct, and the ancient skills that technology has made obsolete in most contexts, but that become essential in zones where technology fails, where communication falls silent, where compasses spin, where you're alone in ways that pre-technological humans understood intimately, but that modern humans experience rarely and find profoundly unsettling, making the zone of silence significant not just for what it is physically, but for what it represents psychologically, for how it makes us feel when we enter it, for what it reveals about our dependencies and vulnerabilities, for the way it transforms us from connected, orientated, confident navigators of modern world into isolated, uncertain, disoriented travelers who must rely on ourselves rather than on systems, who must trust our perceptions rather than our instruments, who must acknowledge that there are places, even now, even with all our technology, where we're still vulnerable to the silence, to the disorientation, to the profound strangeness of spaces that don't function according to the rules we expect, that challenge us to either explain them through science or acknowledge them as genuinely anomalous, as locations where reality works differently for reasons we don't understand and perhaps cannot understand without expanding our physics, without accepting that the electromagnetic universe we think we comprehend still contains zones of silence, zones of strangeness, zones where the normal rules are suspended or altered, and where we're forced to confront how little we actually understand about the fundamental forces and fields that we've built our entire technological civilization upon. Forces that work perfectly nearly everywhere, but that in certain locations, like the zone of silence, behave in ways that remind us that our understanding is incomplete, that nature still holds surprises, that there are places on Earth where silence reigns, not because no one speaks, but because speaking doesn't propagate, where isolation is enforced not by distance, but by the failure of the electromagnetic medium that connects the rest of the world, where the zone of silence lives up to its name, either through geological accident that creates unusual but natural conditions, or through something stranger, something that makes it not just unusual, but genuinely anomalous. Not just difficult, but impossible, according to physics, as we currently understand it, leaving the zone as it has always been: silent, strange, significant, suspended between explanation and mystery, between science and legend, between the desert it occupies and the electromagnetic void it allegedly creates, where communication fails, where compasses spin, where the zone of silence earns its name every day. Either through effects we could explain if we studied carefully enough, with proper equipment and rigorous methodology, or through effects that would require us to rewrite our understanding of how electromagnetic fields work, how radio propagates, how reality itself functions in this specific patch of Mexican desert that has defied complete explanation despite decades of investigation, that continues to attract curiosity and speculation, and visitors who want to experience the silence, who want to test their equipment, who want to stand in a place where the modern world's invisible infrastructure allegedly stops working, and where you're forced to confront what remains when the technological mediation is removed, when silence isn't metaphor, but is actual, when the zone earns its name because the electromagnetic radiation that carries information and connects humans and enables navigation simply doesn't propagate normally there, either because of magnetic minerals and radio absorption, creating difficult but comprehensible conditions, or because of something stranger, something unexplained, something that makes the zone of silence more than unusual geology and transforms it into genuine mystery, into place where reality doesn't quite follow the rules, where the silence is deep and strange and real. Time slips, walking into different eras without warning. You're walking down a familiar street in a city you know well, maybe heading to work or running errands on an ordinary afternoon, when something shifts. The quality of light changes. The sounds around you become different. No car engines, no electronic hum, just horses and wooden wheels on cobblestone you didn't realize was under the asphalt. The buildings look the same, but different, cleaner, or older. Architectural details that were renovated now appear in their original state. And the people you pass are dressed in clothing from another era, walking with purpose and paying you no attention, as if you're the one who doesn't belong. You've stepped into the past, or a version of it, without transition or warning, without crossing any obvious threshold, except continuing to walk forward on a street that somehow became a corridor through time. These moments last seconds or minutes before reality snaps back, before the cobblestones become asphalt again, and the Victorian pedestrians dissolve into modern crowds, leaving you standing disoriented on a street that looks exactly as it should, but that you know for certain was different just moments before, was occupied by a different era, was showing you a window into time that shouldn't be accessible just by walking down an ordinary sidewalk on an ordinary day. These are time slips, and they've been reported throughout history by credible witnesses whose accounts can't be easily dismissed as hallucination or fabrication. The experiences share consistent characteristics. They happen spontaneously without warning or intention. They involve ordinary locations becoming portals to the past. They include sensory details far beyond what imagination or daydreaming typically provides. And they end abruptly, snapping back to the present with jarring suddenness that leaves witnesses certain something genuine occurred, something that briefly allowed them access to time that wasn't their own, to moments that already happened being somehow accessible again, as if the past doesn't actually disappear, but continues existing in layers that occasionally become visible when conditions align in ways we don't understand. The most famous documented case occurred in 1901, when two Oxford academics, Charlotte Ann Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain, visited the Palace of Versailles and experienced what they later realized was a time slip into the late 18th century. They described walking through the gardens and encountering people in period costume that they initially assumed were historical reenactors or staff in costume. But the details were wrong for intentional recreation. The clothing was weathered and authentic, The faces of the people they saw had an immediacy and presence that performers don't convey. The atmosphere of the location felt different in ways that went beyond visual appearance. They saw buildings and landscape features that no longer existed in 1901, but that historical records confirmed had been present in Marie Antoinette's time. They saw a woman they believed was Marie Antoinette herself, sketching in the gardens, dressed in summer clothing from the 1780s, completely unaware of their presence or seemingly existing in her own time while they observed from theirs. The two women didn't initially realize they'd experienced something impossible. It was only when they compared notes and researched the history of Versailles that they understood the people and buildings they'd seen shouldn't have been there, that they'd somehow walked into August 1789, seeing the palace grounds as they existed just before the Revolution, overlapping with that time period while remaining physically present in 1901. Their account, published as an adventure, was rigorously detailed and included specific observations that matched historical records they couldn't have known without extensive research, suggesting they actually saw the past rather than hallucinating or confabulating details. Time slips often occur in locations with significant historical weight, places where major events occurred, or where the past feels particularly present. Battlefields, old buildings, historic districts. These are common settings, as if locations can somehow retain or replay the past, as if time doesn't flow uniformly, but pools and eddies in places where human experience was particularly intense or significant. Gettysburg has numerous reports of people seeing soldiers in period uniforms, hearing cannon fire and musket shots, smelling gunpowder and the specific atmosphere of battle before everything returns to the quiet tourist site it currently is. The Tower of London, Hampton Court, countless English castles and manor houses have accounts of visitors walking into rooms that appear as they did centuries ago, encountering people in period dress going about their daily activities, experiencing complete sensory immersion in the past for minutes before the scene dissolves. But time slips also occur in ordinary locations with no particular historical significance, suggesting the phenomenon isn't solely about places retaining the past, but about time itself being less linear and separated than we assume. A woman in Liverpool in 1996 walked down a familiar shopping street and found herself in the 1950s. The storefronts changed. The cars were vintage models that looked new. The people wore 50s fashions, and she stood there watching this scene unfold around her before a van drove through the vision, and she was back in the present. She provided specific details about store names and locations that she later verified through historical research had actually existed in that exact location in the 50s. Details she had no way of knowing before her experience. The Bold Street area in Liverpool has become known for time slip frequency, with multiple independent reports from different people describing similar experiences of the street, appearing as it did in different decades. The consistency of location suggests that some places might be more prone to the phenomenon, that geographic or electromagnetic conditions could create circumstances where temporal boundaries become permeable. Or perhaps the concentration of reports creates its own effect, awareness and expectation, making people more likely to notice and interpret unusual experiences as time slips when they occur in known hotspots. The sensory completeness of time slips is what distinguishes them from simple visual hallucinations or false memories. Witnesses describe not just seeing the past, but experiencing it through all senses. Sounds are different. The acoustic environment changes from modern urban noise to whatever sounds characterize the period they've slipped into. Smells are period appropriate. The air quality feels different, sometimes cleaner if slipping into pre-industrial times, or filled with smoke and animal odors, if experiencing eras when those were common urban characteristics. The light has different quality: natural sunlight unfiltered by modern pollution, or the specific amber tones from gas streetlights in Victorian slips. The temperature and humidity can differ from what they were moments before. This multisensory immersion suggests either elaborate hallucination involving multiple brain systems simultaneously, or actual physical displacement into conditions that match the past. The people encountered during time slips typically don't acknowledge the witness's presence. They go about their activities as if the modern person isn't there, as if they exist in their own time, and the witness is observing without being able to interact. Occasionally, however, there are reports of brief interaction, eye contact with someone from the past, a nod of acknowledgement, even brief conversation before the witness realizes the person they're speaking to is dressed in clothing from a different era and speaking with vocabulary and accent patterns that don't match the present. These interactive slips are rarer and more disturbing because they suggest not just one-way viewing of the past, but actual overlap. Moments when two time periods are simultaneously present and people from each can perceive each other. There are also reverse time slips, accounts from historical records where people described encountering individuals dressed strangely, speaking in unfamiliar ways, seeming confused about their surroundings before vanishing. If time slips work in both directions, if the past occasionally becomes visible to people in the present, then the present must occasionally become visible to people in the past. Medieval chronicles mention strangers appearing and disappearing, people wearing clothing of unknown style, who spoke languages that weren't quite right, who asked questions about locations and dates, as if confused about when and where they were. Could these have been time slippers from the future, our present, briefly visible in the past before snapping back to their proper time? The mechanism that might cause time slips remains purely speculative. Quantum physics suggests time might not be the simple, linear progression we experience consciously, that all moments might exist simultaneously in some framework, with consciousness moving through them sequentially, but the actual structure of space-time containing past, present, and future as coexisting states. If this is true, then time slips might be moments when consciousness accidentally accesses a time period it's not supposed to be experiencing when the normal constraints that keep awareness locked to the present moment briefly fail, allowing perception of the past as if it were present, because at some fundamental level, it still is present, still exists in the structure of space-time, even though our consciousness has moved past it. Electromagnetic anomalies have been proposed as potential triggers. If certain electromagnetic field configurations can affect consciousness or perception, then walking into an area with unusual EM characteristics might shift awareness in ways that allow access to past time states. This would explain why some locations have repeated time slip reports. They have persistent EM conditions that repeatedly create the circumstances allowing temporal displacement. It would also explain the spontaneity. You don't need to do anything special, just be in the right location when conditions align. There are also theories involving parallel timelines or dimensions where the past never ended but continues on separate tracks. What we experience as time slips might be moments when barriers between timelines thin, when we briefly perceive parallel realities where time progresses differently, or where the past is still actively occurring. We step into a dimension where it's still 1880 or 1950. Observe it briefly, then return to our own timeline. This framework explains why the past we see is active and living, rather than static recording. It's not memory or replay, but actual ongoing reality in another dimensional stream. The psychological impact on witnesses is significant and consistent. Time slips produce profound disorientation and often existential crisis. If you can walk into the past without warning, what does that mean about the nature of time and reality? If the past still exists and can be accessed accidentally, then is it truly past? Or are all times somehow present, and we're simply limited to experiencing one slice at a time? Witnesses report spending weeks or months trying to rationalize their experience, researching the historical period they witnessed, trying to find logical explanations before ultimately accepting that they experienced something that shouldn't be possible according to conventional understanding of how time works. Some people experience repeated time slips as if having one makes additional episodes more likely. They report becoming sensitive to the feeling that precedes a slip, a quality to the air or light that signals transition is about to occur, a sensation of unreality or displacement that gives them seconds of warning before the present disappears and the past becomes visible. These repeat experiencers sometimes describe feeling unstuck in time, as if their consciousness doesn't anchor properly to the present anymore, as if they're always slightly at risk of sliding into past moments, existing at the boundary between times, rather than securely locked in the current moment. Children seem to experience time slips more frequently than adults, or at least report them more innocently. A child will describe playing in the yard and suddenly seeing different houses, different people, everything looking old-fashioned before returning to normal. Adults dismiss these as imagination, but the specificity of details children provide sometimes matches historical facts about the location that the child wouldn't have known. Are children's perceptions more flexible, less rigidly locked to consensus reality, making them more likely to slip between times? Or do adults experience them just as frequently, but rationalize and dismiss the experiences rather than reporting them? The duration of time slips varies dramatically. Some last only seconds, a flicker where the street looks different for an instant before returning to normal. Others persist for minutes, giving the witness time to walk through the altered environment, observe details, even panic about being trapped in the past before the transition reverses. There are very rare accounts of time slips lasting hours, where the person becomes convinced they've actually traveled in time and may not be able to return, only to eventually snap back to the present exhausted and disoriented, having experienced what felt like half a day in the past. The question of whether physical time travel is occurring, or whether time slips are purely perceptual, consciousness accessing past sensory information without the body actually displacing, remains unresolved. Witnesses feel physically present in the past, can touch objects and surfaces that appear aged or different, can feel temperature and air quality that match the period. But they don't interact meaningfully with the environment, don't leave traces, don't affect the past in observable ways. It's possible they're experiencing perfect hallucination that includes tactile and proprioceptive elements. Or it's possible they're genuinely physically present, but in a state that doesn't allow them to causally interact, like ghosts of the future observing but not participating. Photography during time slips occasionally captures anomalies, images that show period details that weren't visible to the naked eye, or that show the location looking as it does currently, with no evidence of the historical scene the photographer claims to have been witnessing. This suggests the time slip might be consciousness level, rather than affecting physical light and camera sensors. That the brain is generating the experience from accessing temporal information somehow, while the actual physical light reaching the eyes and the camera remains contemporary. Or it suggests that cameras don't see across time the way human consciousness can under the right conditions. Skeptics attribute time slips to temporal lobe epilepsy, microsleep dream states, confabulation where imagination and research combine to create false memories of experiencing the past, or simple misinterpretation of reenactors or film sets. Some of these explanations work for individual cases. Certainly some reports are misidentifications or psychological experiences, rather than genuine temporal displacement. But the consistency across centuries of reports, the specific historical details witnesses provide without having researched them, the multiple witnesses occasionally experiencing the same slip simultaneously, and the sheer strangeness of the phenomenon being so consistent despite coming from people across cultures and time periods, suggests that at least some percentage of reports represent something genuinely anomalous. Multiple witnesses experiencing the same time slipped together is particularly evidential. When two people walking together both see the same scene from the past, both describe the same details, both experience the same disorientation when it ends, the shared experience rules out individual hallucination or psychological aberration. The Versailles case involved two witnesses. Several Liverpool Bold Street reports involve pairs or groups seeing the same temporal displacement. If time slips are purely neurological misfiring, they shouldn't be contagious or shared. If they represent actual perceptual access to the past, then multiple people in proximity should be able to access it simultaneously, which matches the evidence. The implications of time slips, if they're genuine, are staggering for physics and philosophy. They suggest time isn't the unidirectional flow we experience consciously, but something more complex, possibly all at once, from perspectives outside of time, possibly composed of layers or streams that can overlap, possibly accessible in non-linear ways under conditions we don't understand. They suggest the past doesn't cease to exist, but remains present in some form, either as information encoded in space-time that can be accessed, or as ongoing reality in parallel dimensions. They suggest consciousness might not be as locked to the present moment as we assume, that awareness can potentially access temporal locations outside the current moment under the right circumstances. For those who've experienced time slips, the philosophical implications matter less than the immediate certainty that they've witnessed something impossible. They were walking down a street, and suddenly that street was a different time, was populated by people from the past going about their lives, was fully realized and completely real for seconds or minutes before dissolving back into the present. They can't prove it happened beyond their testimony, can't usually produce evidence beyond their detailed descriptions, but they know what they experienced wasn't dream or hallucination or imagination. It was perception of the past, access to time that already occurred but somehow hadn't disappeared, had remained accessible through a mechanism we don't understand and can't control, presenting itself without invitation to ordinary people during ordinary activities, proving that the boundaries we assume separate past from present might be far more permeable than physics currently acknowledges. And somewhere right now, someone is walking down a familiar street when the light changes quality, when the sounds shift to horses and cartwheels, when the people around them suddenly wear clothing from a different century, when they realize without understanding how or why that they've stepped out of their own time into the past. Walking through a moment that already happened, being somehow made present again, living in overlap between eras that should be separated by decades or centuries, but that for these brief, inexplicable moments exist simultaneously in the same space, accessible to consciousness that has accidentally found the seam between times, the crack in temporal structure through which the past becomes visible, before reality corrects itself, and their return to the present, standing disoriented on a street that looks exactly as it should, but that they know for certain was different just seconds before, was showing them time that shouldn't be accessible, but was, leaving them forever changed by the certainty that the past hasn't disappeared at all, but continues existing somewhere we can't normally reach, waiting in the layers of time, occasionally becoming visible when conditions align to create those impossible moments when walking forward through space somehow becomes walking backward through time, allowing us glimpses of what was, reminding us that everything we think we understand about time might be comfortable fiction, and that reality is far stranger, far more fluid, far more accessible across its temporal dimensions than our everyday experience suggests, waiting for the next time slip to prove it again to the next person who walks unsuspecting through a door into a different era, and realizes too late that time isn't what we've been taught, isn't linear and irreversible and neatly partitioned, but something else entirely, something that allows the past to reach forward and touch us, allows us to reach backward and see it, creating moments of impossible overlap that change everyone who experiences them, leaving them certain of something they can never prove but can never doubt, that they've walked through time and returned, that they've seen what shouldn't be visible, that the past is still there, still happening, still accessible, waiting in the structure of reality for the next crack to open and pull someone through. The Tunguska event. Did something explode or something land? On the morning of June 30th, 1908, something entered the atmosphere over Siberia and detonated with a force estimated at 10 to 15 megatons, roughly 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The explosion occurred near the stony Tunguska River in a remote, sparsely populated region of Russia, flattening approximately 80 million trees across 800 square miles of forest, the blast pattern radiating outward from the epicenter, like a massive butterfly wing of destruction visible from aerial photographs decades later. Witnesses from settlements up to 400 miles away reported seeing a column of blue light nearly as bright as the sun moving across the sky, followed by a flash and shock wave that shattered windows, knocked people off their feet, and was detected by seismographs across Europe and Asia. Yet when investigators finally reached the site nearly 2 decades later, the remoteness and political turmoil of revolutionary Russia delayed systematic study. They found something deeply puzzling: no impact crater. Despite the massive explosion, despite the devastation spread across hundreds of square miles, there was no crater, no obvious point of impact, no meteorite fragments in quantities that would explain an explosion of that magnitude. The trees at ground zero remained standing, stripped of branches and bark, but upright like telephone poles, while trees further out were flattened in a radial pattern, pointing away from the blast center. It looked like an airburst, like something had exploded above the ground rather than hitting it. But if it was a meteor or comet, as conventional explanations propose, why did it explode in the air instead of cratering the ground? And where did all the material go? Or is the lack of crater evidence not that something exploded, but that something landed? That whatever came down over Tunguska wasn't a natural object following ballistic trajectory, but something else? Something that decelerated or maneuvered, that touched down rather than impacting, that left minimal physical trace because it wasn't destroyed but rather remained intact and possibly even departed, leaving behind only the evidence of its passage and the massive energy release that accompanied whatever actually occurred in that remote Siberian forest on a summer morning over a century ago. The conventional explanation that has achieved scientific consensus is that a stony asteroid or comet approximately 50 to 60 meters in diameter entered Earth's atmosphere and exploded at an altitude of roughly 5 to 10 kilometers due to the immense stresses of atmospheric entry. The object was traveling at tens of thousands of kilometers per hour, and as it penetrated deeper into the atmosphere, the air pressure building up in front of it created forces that exceeded the structural integrity of the rock or ice, causing it to fragment and then explode, releasing its kinetic energy in a massive airburst. The energy equivalent of 10 to 15 megatons detonated in the air, rather than on the ground, which is why there's no crater, but why the damage pattern matches nuclear airburst testing. pressure waves radiating outward, thermal effects scorching vegetation, the blast strong enough to topple trees for dozens of miles. The lack of significant meteorite fragments is explained by the object being relatively fragile, possibly a comet made largely of ice and dust that vaporized almost completely in the explosion, leaving only microscopic particles dispersed over wide areas, rather than large chunks that could be easily identified and recovered. This explanation accounts for most of the observed phenomena and is supported by computer modeling that can reproduce the observed damage pattern using asteroid airburst scenarios. It's scientifically respectable, consistent with our understanding of meteor physics, and doesn't require invoking exotic possibilities. For mainstream science, Tunguska is solved. It was a natural cosmic impact, rare and dramatic, but ultimately comprehensible within existing frameworks. Yet questions persist that keep alternative theories alive more than a century after the event. The composition and trajectory raise issues. If it was a stony asteroid, some fragments should have survived to reach the ground. Asteroid material is typically more durable than the complete vaporization scenario requires. If it was a comet, the low density and high ice content make it more likely to explode at high altitude. But comets approaching from deep space should have trajectories that are more steeply angled than what witnesses described. The object that entered the atmosphere over Tunguska was described as coming in at a relatively shallow angle, more consistent with something that was maneuvering or that had already been captured into Earth orbit, rather than plunging in from interplanetary space. Witnesses reported that the object's path changed direction during its approach, that it wasn't following a simple ballistic curve, but appeared to be under some form of control or exhibiting aerodynamic behavior that shouldn't occur with a meteor. The trees standing at ground zero, while trees further out were flattened, is geometrically consistent with an airburst, but is also one of the elements that has fueled speculation about something landing rather than exploding. If the blast occurred directly above, the pressure wave would radiate outward horizontally at ground level, flattening trees in all directions except immediately below the burst point where the force was directed downward rather than laterally. This matches airburst physics perfectly, but it also matches what you might expect if something descended vertically, creating downward force that left the trees at the center, standing while the landing, or hovering, created outward forces that flattened the surrounding forest. The distinction between these scenarios is subtle, but significant. One involves destruction of the object. The other involves a controlled approach. Anomalous radioactivity has been reported in the region, though the data is contested and complicated by later Soviet nuclear testing in the area. Some researchers claim elevated radiation levels and unusual isotope ratios in soil samples from the epicenter that don't match normal background or fallout from later nuclear tests, suggesting that whatever occurred at Tunguska involved energetic processes that left radioactive signatures. This could be consistent with a natural impact if the object contained unusual compositions, or if the explosion created conditions that synthesized radioactive isotopes. Or it could suggest something involving nuclear processes or exotic energy sources that wouldn't be present in a simple meteor explosion. Accelerated tree growth in the years following 1908 has been documented, with trees that survived the blast showing growth rings indicating abnormally rapid development for decades after the event. Some interpret this as consistent with radiation exposure or other environmental changes that stimulated growth. Others suggest it simply reflects reduced competition. So many trees were destroyed that survivors had access to more resources and grew faster. But the pattern and duration of the enhanced growth have characteristics that some researchers find unusual compared to what would be expected from simply removing competition. The magnetic anomalies reported in the area add another layer. Compass deviations and unusual magnetic field readings have been documented around the epicenter. Though again, these are difficult to attribute definitively because the region's geology and later human activity could explain the anomalies. If they're connected to the Tunguska event, they might suggest the object had unusual magnetic properties, or that the explosion created conditions that altered the magnetic field in lasting ways, or they might be entirely unrelated and coincidental. The lack of a debris field proportionate to the explosion's magnitude is the element that troubles some investigators most acutely. Microparticles have been found that could be from the impactor, but the total mass recovered is far less than what an object capable of producing a 15 megaton explosion should have contained. If the object was 50 to 60 meters in diameter, with composition similar to known asteroids, even near complete vaporization should have left more residue than has been detected. Either the object was far less massive than calculations suggest, which would mean it was traveling impossibly fast to produce the observed energy release, or much of the mass somehow didn't vaporize, in which case, where did it go? This is where the landing theory gains traction among those unsatisfied with conventional explanations. If something came down at Tunguska that wasn't destroyed, if it was a craft that decelerated and landed or hovered, releasing energy in the process but remaining largely intact, then the lack of massive debris makes sense. The object wouldn't have vaporized because it wasn't moving at meteor speeds by the time it reached the surface, wasn't destroyed by impact because it made a controlled approach, and left no crater because it didn't crash, but rather set down. The energy release might have been engines or systems creating the deceleration. A massive energy expenditure that flattened the surrounding forest as a side effect of whatever propulsion or energy manipulation technology the craft employed. The immediate response by Tsarist authorities was limited due to the remoteness and the political instability that would soon erupt into revolution and civil war. But there are accounts of expeditions sent to the area in the years immediately following the event that reported unusual findings before systematic scientific investigation began. These early accounts mentioned strange objects or structures glimpsed in the forest, lights seen in the region at night, and locals reporting unusual phenomena in the years following the explosion. The reliability of these accounts is questionable. They're fragmentary, secondhand, and filtered through nearly a century of retelling. But they suggest that even before scientific consensus formed around the meteor explanation, there was speculation and observation suggesting something anomalous might have remained in the area. The first major scientific expedition in 1927, led by Leonid Kulik, found the devastated forest but no crater, which Kulik initially found baffling because he was expecting to find meteorite impact evidence. He spent years returning to the site, excavating, searching for fragments, trying to understand how such a massive explosion could occur without leaving the physical evidence he expected. He died before the airburst explanation became widely accepted, and some of his later writings suggest he was becoming less convinced that a simple meteor explained everything he observed. He noted anomalies in the blast pattern, unusual soil characteristics, and witness accounts that didn't quite fit the straightforward impact scenario. Soviet interest in the site intensified during the Cold War, partly because understanding large explosions had obvious military relevance, and partly because the absence of a crater and the airburst characteristics made Tunguska useful for studying the effects of nuclear detonations without actually detonating nuclear weapons in remote areas. Extensive surveys were conducted, and much of the data remains classified or was classified for decades, leading to speculation that something significant was found that wasn't made public. Conspiracy theorists suggest the Soviets recovered technology or materials from the site that they kept secret, either because it was extraterrestrial or because it represented advanced terrestrial technology that had been lost or kept hidden. The extraterrestrial craft theory proposes several scenarios. In one version, an alien spacecraft suffered a catastrophic failure and exploded as it attempted to land or pass through the atmosphere, explaining the airburst characteristics while accounting for the lack of normal meteor composition. In another version, the craft was deliberately destroyed, either by its occupants preventing it from falling into primitive human hands, or by defensive systems from another group preventing the craft from landing. The most intriguing version suggests the craft successfully landed or hovered, discharged whatever occupants or cargo it carried, and then departed, with the explosion being either a side effect of its engines during the landing, departure sequence, or a deliberate destruction of the landing site to remove evidence of the visit. The antimatter theory is occasionally proposed, suggesting that a chunk of antimatter from space entered the atmosphere and annihilated upon contact with normal matter, producing the massive energy release with no residue because matter, antimatter. Annihilation converts mass entirely to energy. This would explain the explosion magnitude, the lack of debris, and potentially some of the unusual effects reported. However, antimatter doesn't naturally accumulate into chunks large enough to produce these effects, and it's unclear how such an object would survive traveling through space without encountering normal matter and annihilating long before reaching Earth. Black hole or strange matter theories venture into even more exotic physics, proposing that a micro black hole or strange matter object passed through Earth at Tunguska, releasing energy during its interaction with normal matter, but continuing through the planet and exiting on the other side, explaining why no crater or residue was left. These theories are scientifically dubious because such objects should have different observable effects than what was witnessed, but they demonstrate the range of explanations that have been proposed, attempting to account for the Tunguska anomalies. The witness accounts are extensive and come from multiple sources. Indigenous Evenki people who lived in the region, Russian settlers in nearby towns, travelers who were in the area, creating a substantial testimonial record despite the remoteness. These accounts describe the object's appearance as bright blue or white, moving across the sky, sometimes described as cylindrical or cigar-shaped, rather than the expected meteor point of light. The descriptions of the explosion's effects, the heat wave, the shock wave, the column of fire and smoke rising to enormous height, are consistent across witnesses. But some accounts include details that don't fit simple meteor impact, the object changing direction during flight, hovering or slowing before the explosion, making sounds before impact that meteors don't typically produce because they're traveling supersonically ahead of their own sound. The indigenous Evenki have legends about the event that have been passed down orally. Some of these legends describe the visitor from the sky as a god or spirit, as punishment for human transgressions, or as the arrival of something powerful and not of this world. The interpretation of these legends is complicated by the fact that they were collected decades after the event and filtered through translation and cultural frameworks, but they consistently describe the event as extraordinary, as something that changed the land and that continues to have significance in local consciousness. Some Evenki refused to approach the epicenter for years, claiming the area was cursed or that something dangerous remained there. Modern expeditions continue to visit the site, using increasingly sophisticated equipment to search for anomalies, to measure radiation and magnetic fields, to sample soil and vegetation for unusual compositions. The site has become a destination for both scientific investigation and alternative research groups looking for evidence of something beyond conventional explanation. Each expedition seems to find enough to maintain their preferred interpretation, while failing to find definitive proof that would settle the question conclusively. The fact that Tunguska remains debated more than a century later, despite extensive study and the availability of modern analytical techniques, suggests either that the conventional explanation is correct, but the evidence has been degraded by time and later contamination, or that the conventional explanation is incomplete, and something genuinely anomalous occurred that we lack the framework to properly interpret. The remoteness that delayed initial investigation also makes it impossible to go back and gather the pristine evidence that might have existed immediately after the event, when whatever occurred was fresh and hadn't been complicated by a century of environmental changes, nuclear testing fallout, industrial development, and repeated human expeditions contaminating the site. What we know for certain is that something released massive energy over the Tunguska region in 1908, that the explosion flattened forests and was detected across a substantial portion of the planet, and that whatever caused it left minimal physical trace despite the magnitude of the event. Whether this represents a well-understood natural phenomenon, asteroid or comet airburst, or something else, something that involved a craft that landed or attempted to land, something that was destroyed or that destroyed evidence of its presence, something that represents contact with non-human intelligence or technology, remains contested. The lack of crater continues to be the central mystery, the element that can be explained through airburst physics, but that also allows alternative interpretations to persist, that keeps the question open despite scientific consensus claiming it's resolved. Tunguska stands as one of the most powerful unexplained events in modern history. A massive explosion that occurred in a remote location where investigation was delayed long enough that crucial evidence was lost, leaving us with a scenario where multiple explanations can be constructed from the remaining data, but none can be proven with absolute certainty. Whether the sky opened and dropped a rock that exploded, or whether something else came down over that Siberian forest, something that maneuvered and landed and possibly even departed, something that flattened trees and released enormous energy, not from destruction, but from operation, something that we lack the framework to properly identify, because we're still assuming cosmic impacts when the evidence might actually be suggesting visitation, remains one of those questions where the official answer satisfies most, but where the anomalies trouble those who look closely, where the lack of crater echoes like an empty space in the center of the devastation, an absence that might be exactly what you'd expect if something didn't crash and explode, but rather arrived and landed and left the forest flattened not from impact, but from the presence of something from elsewhere, something that came down over Tunguska on June 30th, 1908, and left behind enough questions to fuel speculation for a century, enough mystery to ensure that the event remains not a solved historical curiosity, but an ongoing debate about what actually happened, whether something exploded or something landed, whether Tunguska represents natural cosmic violence or artificial controlled descent, whether we're looking at a rock that vaporized or a craft that didn't, and whether the absence of a crater is proof that an airburst occurred or evidence that something came down and walked away, leaving the forest destroyed but taking itself with it, vanishing back into the sky or underground or into whatever space it came from, leaving Tunguska as a scar on the landscape and a permanent question mark in the history of unexplained phenomena, an event that was witnessed but never fully understood, documented but never definitively explained, investigated but never truly solved, despite official assurances that we know what happened, that it was just a meteor, just a cosmic accident, just natural forces doing what natural forces do. When the evidence, if you look at it with questions rather than answers in mind, if you wonder about the absence instead of just accepting the explanation for it, suggests that maybe what came down over Tunguska wasn't destroyed at all, wasn't a victim of atmospheric forces, it couldn't survive, but rather was something that intended to be there, that chose that location, that came down under control and left under control. and left behind only the mystery, only the flattened forest, only the energy signature, only the lack of crater that conventional wisdom explains with airburst physics. But that might alternatively be explained by something that never crashed because it never intended to. That came down over Tunguska for purposes we'll never know, unless it comes back, unless whatever was there in 1908 returns, and we finally understand that the absence of crater was never the puzzle requiring explanation, but rather the clue revealing what actually happened, that something landed, that something was there, that something came down and possibly left and took with it the answers, leaving us only questions that persist across more than a century since that morning when the sky over Siberia opened and released something into the forest, something that changed the land and puzzles us still. The staircase in the woods, mysterious structures that appear in forests, deep in forests where few people venture, miles from roads or trails or any evidence of human habitation. Park rangers and hikers occasionally encounter something that makes no sense, something that shouldn't exist and has no logical explanation for being where it is. It's a staircase, perfectly constructed, rising from the forest floor into nothing, steps leading up to empty air, as if the house they once served simply vanished while the stairs remained. They're not ruins in the traditional sense. They're not crumbling or overgrown or showing centuries of decay. They're often in remarkably good condition, made of wood or stone or metal, structurally sound, sometimes even looking recently built despite being in locations where no construction equipment could have reached them and where no foundations or other building remnants exist anywhere nearby. Just stairs, ascending from nowhere to nowhere, standing in the middle of wilderness as if they were waiting for something, as if they serve a purpose that we can't see, as if they're markers or doorways or traps created by intelligence that understands something about forest spaces that humans don't. Placed with intention, we'll never comprehend unless we're foolish enough to climb them and discover what happens when you ascend stairs that lead to nothing in places where they shouldn't exist at all. The phenomenon became widely known through accounts from search and rescue personnel, particularly stories shared online by park rangers describing the strangest things they've encountered during operations. Among the reports of bizarre disappearances, unexplained sounds, and disturbing discoveries, the staircases stood out for their specific wrongness. Rangers describe finding them in locations so remote that getting construction materials there would require helicopter transport. Yet there's no evidence of recent human activity, no tool marks that look modern, no trash or disturbance that accompanies construction sites. The stairs just exist, sometimes wooden staircases that look like they belong to Victorian houses, sometimes stone steps that appear ancient, sometimes metal, fire escape style stairs that look industrial, all standing alone in the forest with no other structures visible anywhere in the surrounding terrain. The rangers report being told during training never to approach the stairs, never to climb them, never to touch them if possible, and absolutely never to go near them if you're alone. This is an official policy written in any manual, but rather knowledge passed down from experienced personnel to new recruits. Warnings given in serious tones that suggest these aren't superstitions, but safety protocols, based on actual incidents that aren't discussed publicly. When pressed for explanation, the veterans don't provide details, just reiterate that the stairs are dangerous in ways that aren't obvious, that people who've interacted with them have disappeared or been found in conditions that suggest something terrible happened, that the official stance is to note the location and avoid the area, never acknowledge them in written reports, never tell civilians about them, and absolutely never, under any circumstances, climb them. What happens if you climb the stairs is the subject of speculation and fragmentary accounts that are difficult to verify. Some stories describe people ascending the stairs and simply disappearing, never reaching the top, because at some point between steps, they transition to somewhere else, cease to exist in normal space, get pulled into whatever dimension or state the stairs actually connect to. Other accounts involve climbers reaching the top and experiencing disorientation, lost time, finding themselves in different locations than where they started with no memory of how they traveled the distance, or developing psychological issues that manifest as paranoia, persistent sense of being watched, or obsessive behavior around patterns and numbers. There are also descriptions of climbers returning from the stairs, physically present, but fundamentally changed, their personalities different, their memories altered, their bodies showing injuries or marks that have no explainable cause. They might speak about seeing things from the top of the stairs, vistas that don't match the forest they're actually in, skies that are the wrong color, or feeling that something was watching them from above as they climbed, something that lives where the stairs lead, something that permits ascent but might not permit descent, something that decides on a case-by-case basis whether you're allowed to return or whether you'll stay wherever the stairs actually go. The construction of the stairs is often anachronistic, styles and methods that don't match the age of the forest around them, or that use materials that weren't available in that region during periods when the construction style was common. Victorian-style carved wooden staircases found in forests that weren't settled until the mid-20th century. Stone steps with architectural features from European castles located in American wilderness where no such structures were ever built. Industrial metal stairs showing rust patterns that suggest decades of exposure, yet appearing in locations where metal construction has never occurred and where the rust should have progressed much further given the apparent age. The positioning is also wrong. They're not always on flat ground. Sometimes they ascend from hillsides at angles that would make them useless for any practical purpose, starting partway up a slope and climbing at a pitch that suggests they were designed for a structure that was oriented differently than the terrain they now occupy. Sometimes they're in ravines or beside streams where no foundation could support a building, where water would have undermined any structure. Yet the stairs remain stable and solid, despite lacking proper footings or connection to anything that would explain why they haven't collapsed. Animals avoid the stairs. Deer trails go around them rather than near them. Birds don't land on them. Insects don't build webs or nests in them. The exclusion zone around each staircase varies, but is consistently present, as if wildlife senses something about them that triggers instinctive avoidance, that marks them as territory or objects that shouldn't be approached by living things. This animal behavior is one of the elements that most disturbs experienced outdoorsmen. Animals don't avoid human structures arbitrarily. They'll investigate and claim them if they're abandoned and unthreatening. The fact that wildlife treats the forest stairs as forbidden zones suggests the stairs are broadcasting something perceptible to animal senses, something that warns them away at an instinctive level that humans don't consciously register, but that manifests as the deep unease people report feeling when they encounter the stairs. The unease is universal in accounts. People describe immediate wrongness, feeling that they're seeing something they shouldn't, that the stairs are aware of being observed, that approaching them would be a terrible mistake. Some report auditory hallucinations or actual sounds, whispers, music, voices calling from the top of the stairs. Sounds that might be wind, but that have qualities suggesting intelligence or intention. Others experience visual distortions, the air around the stairs seeming to shimmer or shift. The stairs themselves appearing to move or change position when viewed peripherally. Shadows falling from them that don't match the sun position, or that suggest something standing at the top casting shadow, despite nothing being visible. There are theories attempting to explain the staircases within conventional frameworks. Some propose they're remnants of old homesteads or logging operations, that buildings once stood in these locations, and everything else has decayed or been removed while the stairs remained because they were built more robustly or from more durable materials. But this doesn't account for the lack of any other structural remnants for stairs that appear too well preserved given how long they'd have to have been abandoned, or for locations that are geographically unsuitable for any kind of construction and where no historical records indicate human habitation. Others suggest they're art installations or pranks, structures built by people with access to helicopters, or who carried materials deep into wilderness as elaborate hoaxes. This explains the physical presence, but struggles with the expense and effort required, with the fact that many stairs have been there for decades, according to ranger testimony, with the consistency of locations being remote enough that perpetrating such hoaxes would require extraordinary commitment, and with the question of why someone would do this repeatedly in multiple national parks and forests without ever claiming credit or being caught. The paranormal interpretations are numerous and disturbing. Some believe the stairs are dimensional doorways, physical structures that exist in multiple realities simultaneously, looking like abandoned stairs in our dimension, but potentially complete structures in adjacent dimensions. Climbing them allows you to transition between dimensions, which is why people disappear or return changed. They've experienced other realities where the stairs lead somewhere, where they connect to buildings or locations that don't exist here, where whatever rules govern that dimension can affect the climber in ways that persist when they return. Others propose the stairs are markers or traps created by non-human intelligence, entities that live in forests and use familiar structures to lure or test humans. The stairs look human-made and abandoned, trigger human curiosity and the assumption that climbing them is safe, but they're actually designed to select for certain behaviors or characteristics, to identify humans who are curious enough or disobedient enough to climb them despite instinct warning them not to. What happens to those who climb might be abduction, might be testing, might be harvesting of some quality or substance that entity requires, or might be initiation into awareness of whatever exists in forests beyond human perception. There are also theories connecting the stairs to missing persons, particularly the missing 411 cases, documented by David Paulides, where people disappear in national parks under circumstances that don't match normal lost hiker profiles. Many disappearances occur in locations where stairs have been reported. Some bodies are found in positions or locations that are impossible to reach by normal travel, as if the person was transported. Some are found with minimal clothing despite having been properly dressed when they disappeared, or show signs of being outdoors for far longer than the timeline suggests, or are discovered alive with no memory of where they've been. Could the stairs be connected to these disappearances, serving as portals or transportation devices that move people through space in ways that leave them miles from where they vanished, or that move them through time, creating the timeline discrepancies? The warning from rangers to never climb the stairs might be based on specific incidents that are kept from public knowledge to avoid panic or lawsuits. If people have climbed stairs and died, or been injured in ways that suggest something beyond normal accidents, if they've disappeared completely, or been found in conditions that indicate they experienced something traumatic and inexplicable, then official policy would be to prevent future incidents by ensuring personnel avoid the stairs and don't draw public attention to them. The lack of written documentation would follow from the difficulties of officially recording something that shouldn't exist, and that would raise questions about what authorities know and aren't telling the public. Some experiencers report that the stairs feel inviting, that despite intellectual knowledge that they're wrong and dangerous, there's a pull to climb them, a sense that something important waits at the top, that ascending would answer questions or provide experiences worth the risk. This contradicts the fear response that most people report, suggesting either individual variation in how people respond to whatever the stairs emit, or that the stairs themselves respond differently to different people, welcoming some while warning others away, selecting who they want to interact with, based on criteria we don't understand. There are occasional reports of stairs appearing where they weren't before, as if they move or materialize rather than being permanent fixtures. A ranger might work an area for years and know every structure and feature. Then one day, encounter stairs in a location they've been past dozens of times previously, where no stairs existed. This transient quality, if accurate, would suggest the stairs aren't simply abandoned human construction, but something that operates according to different rules, that exists conditionally or travels between locations, that manifests when and where it chooses, rather than remaining fixed in space. The psychological impact on those who've encountered the stairs but resisted climbing them is significant. Many report intrusive thoughts about the stairs afterward, wondering what would have happened if they'd climbed, feeling like they missed an opportunity or narrowly avoided a fate they can't define. Some have dreams about the stairs, nightmares where they're compelled to climb despite knowing it's dangerous, or where they watch others climb and disappear. The stairs seem to leave psychological imprints that persist beyond the encounter, as if seeing them creates a connection that doesn't break just because you walked away. Children who've encountered the stairs sometimes describe seeing figures at the top, people or entities beckoning, inviting them to climb. Adults usually see nothing but empty stairs, which raises the question of whether children perceive something that adults filter out, whether their less culturally conditioned perception allows them to see the truth of what the stairs are and what stands at their terminus, or whether the stairs use visual lures specifically designed to appeal to children who are more likely to obey the impulse to climb before rational fear intervenes. The pattern of where stairs appear is difficult to determine because rangers don't officially document them, and civilians who encounter them rarely report precise locations. But there seem to be clusters in certain regions, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, the Appalachians, and areas with significant Native American history, where indigenous accounts mention spirit worlds or dimensional boundaries in forests. Whether these locations have natural properties that make the stairs more likely to appear, or whether the stairs are concentrated there for other reasons, is impossible to determine without better data. Native American legends from various tribes include references to structures in forests that shouldn't be approached, doorways or paths that lead to spirit realms, or places where the normal world and other worlds overlap. Some describe stairs or ladders as ways that spirits travel between worlds, or as tests that humans might encounter where climbing leads to transformation or disappearance. The stairs that rangers find could be manifestations of whatever phenomena these legends describe. Real structures that have always existed in forests, but that modern humans lack the cultural framework to understand, approaching them as mysterious artifacts, rather than recognizing them as what indigenous traditions might identify as sacred or dangerous thresholds between realities. The question of why stairs specifically, rather than doors or holes or other portal-type structures, might relate to the human psychology of ascending. Stairs invite upward movement, suggest progression and achievement, trigger instincts to climb and see what's higher. A hole in the ground triggers fear and caution because descending into darkness activates survival fears. But stairs ascending trigger curiosity and the assumption that climbing is safe and productive. If the stairs are designed to attract or test humans, the staircase form is psychologically effective in ways that other portal designs wouldn't be. What lies at the top of the stairs, where they actually lead? What happens if you climb them fully, whether they're doorways or traps or tests, or simply structures whose purpose we can't comprehend because we lack the context to understand what they're part of. These questions remain unanswered except through fragmented accounts from people who climbed and returned, whose testimony is often dismissed as hallucination or psychological breakdown, but who insist they experienced something real, something that proved the stairs are functional rather than decorative, that they lead somewhere that isn't empty air, but rather to spaces or states that overlap with normal forest reality in ways that allow structures to exist in both simultaneously. The official silence on the stairs is perhaps the most telling element. If they were simply abandoned homestead remnants, there would be no reason for the careful avoidance that rangers practice, no reason for the warnings passed along informally but never documented, no reason for the apparent policy of pretending they don't exist rather than investigating or removing them. The silence suggests knowledge exists that isn't being shared, that authorities understand something about the stairs that would be difficult to explain publicly, that the decision has been made to minimize interaction rather than attempt to understand or remove them, because understanding them has been tried, and the results made it clear that the best policy is avoidance. And somewhere in forests across the continent, stairs stand alone in clearings or against hillsides, ascending from earth to air, waiting. They wait for the next hiker to stumble across them and feel the pull to climb, for the next ranger to discover a new location where they've appeared, for the next person who dismisses warnings and takes those first steps upward, convinced that nothing will happen, or curious enough about what might happen to accept the risk. The stairs wait with patience that suggests they've been waiting for decades or centuries, that they'll continue waiting because time moves differently for them, or because whatever placed them operates on timescales that make human lifespans irrelevant. And eventually, someone always climbs, always takes the journey up those steps into empty air that might not be empty from the perspective of whatever reality the stairs actually occupy, and discovers what waits at the top, what purpose the stairs serve, what happens when you complete an ascent that should be impossible, but that thousands of stairs scattered through forests are silently, patiently inviting anyone who finds them to attempt, offering elevation to nowhere, as if nowhere might be somewhere we can't see, offering transit to destinations that exist in different dimensions or times or states of reality than the forest floor from which the steps rise, stairs that lead to answers. We might not survive learning, to places we might not return from, to encounters with whatever intelligence knows that humans can't resist stairs, can't see a staircase without wondering what's at the top, will eventually climb despite every warning, despite every instinct screaming danger, despite the absolute certainty that something is wrong with stairs that stand alone in forests miles from anywhere they should exist, ascending into air that might be solid on the other side, opening onto rooms or worlds or things we were never meant to see, but that the stairs offer access to for anyone willing or foolish enough to climb them, to step up from the forest floor and keep climbing until they reach the top, or until they reach whatever waits between the bottom and the top, for those who accept the invitation that stairs in the forest represent, the promise that impossible structures make. The doorway that looks abandoned but might simply be waiting has always been waiting, will always be waiting for the next person to test whether stairs that lead to nowhere actually lead somewhere, somewhere that will prove the warnings were justified, that the stairs are exactly as dangerous as rangers insist, that some structures in forests exist for purposes that have nothing to do with human comprehension and everything to do with whatever remains hidden in wilderness spaces, whatever watches from dimensions we don't see, whatever built stairs in places where no stairs should be and left them there, knowing that eventually someone would find them, would climb them, would discover what happens when you take seriously the architecture of impossible structures. and trust that stairs must lead somewhere, even when all evidence suggests they can't, even when every sense warns you to turn away, to leave them standing in the forest untouched, to resist the pull that stairs exert on human consciousness, the invitation they represent, the promise they make that somewhere up there, at the top of steps that rise from nothing, something waits worth climbing toward, even if you never return from reaching it. The Taos hum, a sound only, some people can hear. In the small town of Taos, New Mexico, surrounded by desert landscape and mountains that have witnessed centuries of human habitation, a percentage of the population hears something that shouldn't be there. They describe it as a low-frequency hum, persistent and maddening, like a distant diesel engine idling or heavy machinery running somewhere just beyond perception's reach. It doesn't come from any identifiable source. It doesn't stop. And most unsettling of all, only some people can hear it, while others, standing in the same location at the same time, hear absolutely nothing. The phenomenon has been investigated by scientists, studied by universities, examined for environmental and technological sources, yet no definitive explanation has emerged. The Taos hum remains, both a physical experience for those who perceive it, and a mystery that suggests our understanding of sound, perception, and possibly reality itself might be incomplete. The reports began surfacing prominently in the early 1990s, though some residents claim the sound existed earlier and simply wasn't discussed widely. Those who hear it describe a frequency that seems to be around 50 to 60 hertz, in the bass range at the very edge of human hearing. It's not loud in the conventional sense, but it's intrusive, penetrating, impossible to ignore once noticed. People report that it's often worse at night, stronger indoors than outdoors, and sometimes accompanied by physical sensations. Vibration in the chest, pressure in the ears, headaches, difficulty sleeping. For some, it's merely annoying. For others, it becomes debilitating, driving them to desperation, to soundproofing their homes, to moving away from Taos, entirely seeking relief that may or may not come. What makes the Taos hum particularly mysterious is its selectivity. Approximately 2% of Taos residents report hearing it consistently. That's enough people that it can't be dismissed as isolated cases of tinnitus or psychological issues. But it's few enough that the majority experience nothing unusual. Researchers brought in sensitive audio equipment trying to record the sound, and in most cases detected nothing out of the ordinary. Some recordings did pick up low-frequency anomalies, but these were inconsistent, didn't correlate clearly with when hearers reported the sound being strongest, and weren't definitively identified as the source of the hum. Theories about the origin proliferate precisely because conventional explanations keep failing to account for all the observations. Industrial sources were investigated first. Ventilation systems, power plants, machinery of any kind that might produce low-frequency noise. Taos doesn't have significant heavy industry, but nearby facilities and infrastructure were examined anyway. None could be conclusively linked to the hum, and shutting down various potential sources didn't stop the sound for those who hear it. Military installations exist in New Mexico, leading to speculation about classified testing or equipment. But the hum predates most modern installations and continues regardless of military activity levels. Some researchers have proposed that the hum is generated by natural geological processes. The region sits on complex geology with faults, underground water systems, and rock formations that might vibrate or resonate under certain conditions. Microseismic activity, movements too small to register as earthquakes but constant at deep levels, could theoretically produce infrasound, frequencies below normal human hearing range, that some individuals somehow perceive. The problem with this explanation is that geological activity doesn't explain why only certain people hear it, why it would be stronger indoors, or why it follows patterns related to time of day, rather than correlating with measurable seismic data. The selectivity of who hears the hum suggests the answer might lie in human physiology rather than environmental sound. Perhaps certain individuals have sensitivity to frequencies or vibrations that most people's auditory systems filter out. Variations in inner ear structure, differences in how the brain processes sensory input, or sensitivity to electromagnetic fields that somehow translate into perceived sound could explain why only a subset of the population experiences the phenomenon. This would make the hum real in the sense that people genuinely perceive it, but generated internally, rather than by an external acoustic source. However, many hearers report that the sound has directionality, that it seems to come from a specific location or direction, which argues against purely internal generation. Electromagnetic fields have been proposed as a potential cause, with some researchers suggesting that people might be responding to power lines, radio transmissions, or other electromagnetic sources in ways that manifest as perceived sound. The theory holds that electromagnetic radiation could stimulate the auditory nerve directly, or interact with the body in ways that create the sensation of hearing. This would explain why the hum is selective. Only those with particular sensitivity would perceive it, and why it doesn't show up on standard acoustic recordings. The correlation with indoor versus outdoor hearing might relate to how electromagnetic fields interact with building materials. Yet comprehensive electromagnetic surveys of Taos haven't identified sources that match the reported characteristics of the hum. There are darker theories, of course, that move beyond conventional physics and biology. Some believe the hum is deliberately generated, a byproduct or intentional feature of classified military research into acoustic weapons, mind control technology, or communication systems operating on frequencies meant to be undetectable. Projects like HAARP, though officially focused on ionospheric research, have attracted speculation about capabilities related to electromagnetic manipulation and low-frequency transmission. Could facilities conducting such research produce effects that sensitive individuals perceive hundreds of miles away? Could the hum be an unintended side effect of technology, operating just outside normal sensory range, detectable only by those whose perception extends slightly beyond the typical human baseline? The phenomenon isn't unique to Taos. Similar hums have been reported in other locations around the world. Bristol in England, Bondi in Australia, Windsor in Ontario, various locations in Europe and Asia. Each location has its own characteristics, its own percentage of affected population, its own failed investigations, and unresolved questions. The global nature of the phenomenon suggests either multiple independent sources producing similar effects, or a single type of source that exists in various locations. If it's technological, that implies widespread deployment of whatever generates the effect. If it's natural, it suggests geological or atmospheric conditions that occur in disparate places but produce consistent perceptual results for sensitive individuals. One of the more unsettling aspects reported by some hum hearers is that the sound seems intelligent or purposeful, as if it carries information or serves a function beyond mere noise. They describe patterns in the hum, variations in intensity or tone that feel meaningful even if they can't decode them. This perception could be the mind's tendency to find patterns in random data, the same process that makes us see faces in clouds or hear words in white noise. Or it could suggest that whatever generates the hum, whether technological or natural, does operate in patterns that some part of human consciousness recognizes even without understanding. The psychological impact on those who hear the hum continuously is significant and well documented. Chronic exposure to inescapable low-frequency sound, whether objectively measurable or perceptually real for the individual, causes stress, sleep disruption, anxiety, and in severe cases, complete disruption of normal life. Some hearers become obsessed with finding the source, conducting their own investigations, measuring and recording, trying to convince others that what they experience is real and external. The frustration of having a sensory experience that others can't validate, or that technology can't consistently detect, creates a kind of isolation, a sense that you're perceiving something real that the rest of the world is blind to. Government studies have been conducted, most notably by the University of New Mexico in the mid-1990s, commissioned specifically to investigate the Taos hum. Researchers interviewed affected individuals, conducted acoustic measurements, reviewed potential sources in the area, and analyzed the characteristics reported by hearers. Their conclusion was inconclusive. They confirmed that people were genuinely experiencing something, that the reports were consistent enough to indicate a real phenomenon, rather than mass delusion. But they couldn't identify the source. The study essentially validated that the mystery exists while failing to solve it, which is perhaps the most honest conclusion given the evidence, but the least satisfying for those seeking answers or relief. Some researchers have explored whether the hum relates to tinnitus, a condition where people hear sounds generated within their own auditory system. However, tinnitus typically presents as ringing, buzzing, or hissing at higher frequencies, not the low drone that characterizes the hum. Additionally, tinnitus sufferers generally recognize that the sound originates internally, while hum hearers consistently describe it as external, with location and directionality. The phenomenological difference suggests these are distinct experiences, though they might share some underlying mechanisms related to auditory processing. The connection between the hum and location is another puzzling element. Some people report that the hum stops when they travel away from Taos, then returns when they come back, suggesting a geographically localized source. Others report hearing similar sounds in different locations, or that the hum followed them when they moved, suggesting the source is either widespread or that their sensitivity persists regardless of location. These contradictory accounts make it difficult to develop a unified theory. Perhaps multiple phenomena are being grouped under the label of the hum, each with different causes but similar perceptual characteristics. There's also the temporal aspect to consider. Hearers report that the hum isn't constant throughout the day, that it has patterns, times when it's stronger or weaker, periods when it disappears entirely. If the source were geological or related to permanent infrastructure, you'd expect more consistency. The variation suggests either a source that operates intermittently, sensitivity that fluctuates based on the hearer's physiological state, or interaction between multiple factors that align only at certain times. Some have tracked these patterns, noting correlations with power grid usage, atmospheric conditions, or even phases of the moon, though none of these correlations have been strong enough to be definitive. The question of why this phenomenon seems to have increased in recent decades also invites speculation. Are more people hearing it because the source has intensified or spread? Are we simply more aware and likely to report unusual experiences now that internet communication allows people to share and validate their perceptions? Or has modern technology introduced new sources of electromagnetic fields, low-frequency vibrations, or environmental factors that human sensitivity responds to in ways we're only beginning to recognize? The proliferation of wireless communication, the expansion of electrical infrastructure, changes in how we use and transmit energy. All of these represent relatively recent developments in human history that might have perceptual consequences we haven't fully mapped. For those who hear the Taos hum, theories and speculation matter less than the immediate reality of their experience. The sound is there, persistent and maddening, affecting their quality of life, their sleep, their sense of well-being. whether it originates from military technology, geological processes, electromagnetic fields, or some aspect of their own neurology. The effect is real, and the lack of definitive answers provides no relief. They live with a sensory experience that most people can't validate, that science can't consistently measure, that has no clear source and no reliable solution. In a way, they exist in a different perceptual reality than their neighbors, hearing something that's either there for everyone but only perceptible to the sensitive, or generated through some process unique to their own consciousness and physiology. The Taos hum remains unsolved, a localized but globally recognized phenomenon that sits at the intersection of acoustics, physiology, psychology, and possibly physics we don't fully understand. It raises fundamental questions about the nature of perception, about whether reality is objective or experiential, about what exists beyond the normal range of human senses, and what it means when some individuals perceive things others don't. The hum continues for those who hear it, a constant reminder that there are mysteries in even the most ordinary places, sounds in the silence that only certain ears can detect, and that our understanding of how we perceive the world around us might be far more limited and far more strange than we typically assume. The 13th floor. Buildings that skip an entire level. Walk into almost any tall building and you'll notice something strange about the elevator buttons. They go from 12 to 14, skipping 13 entirely, as if that number simply doesn't exist, as if an entire floor has been erased from the building's official count. Most people accept this as superstition, a harmless concession to triskaidekaphobia, the fear of the number 13 that supposedly makes floors labeled as such harder to rent or sell. But what if the missing 13th floor isn't missing at all? What if it exists in every building that claims to skip it? A hidden level accessible only through unmarked buttons or specific key codes, a floor that operates outside normal building regulations and oversight, where things happen that were never meant to be documented or discovered. What if every major building in every major city has a 13th floor that you're not supposed to know about, occupied by entities or organizations or activities that require absolute secrecy, hidden not in remote facilities, but right in the middle of urban centers, concealed by the simple expedient of telling everyone that floor doesn't exist? The tradition of skipping 13 in building numbering started in the early 20th century, officially attributed to the superstition that 13 is unlucky. Hotels began omitting the 13th floor because guests supposedly refused to stay there. Office buildings followed because tenants wouldn't lease space on an unlucky floor. By mid-century, the practice was standard in American construction. The 12th floor is followed immediately by the 14th, and everyone pretends this is normal, that buildings somehow transition from 12 to 14 without the space in between actually existing. But architecturally, structurally, the buildings still have that level. The physical space exists. There's concrete and steel and volume between the 12th and 14th floors, regardless of what the elevator panel claims. So what's actually there? The simplest explanation that conspiracists offer is that the 13th floor houses building systems, mechanical rooms, HVAC equipment, electrical infrastructure, maintenance access. This is plausible and even verifiable in some structures where building plans show mechanical floors. But many buildings have dedicated mechanical floors elsewhere, listed honestly as such, with their utility purpose documented and accessible to engineers and maintenance staff. The 13th floor, when it's skipped, simply disappears from documentation entirely, as if acknowledging that physical space would be dangerous or revealing. No floor plans include it. No evacuation diagrams show it. It exists in the structural count, but not in the official building description. a gap in documentation that perfectly matches the physical gap represented by the missing number. There are accounts, difficult to verify but disturbingly consistent, from maintenance workers and security personnel who claim to have accessed the actual 13th floor in buildings that officially don't have one. They describe finding unmarked elevator buttons that require specific key codes or override procedures. Buttons that aren't visible in normal operation, but that exist if you know where to look and how to activate them. When these buttons are pressed, the elevator stops at the missing floor, opening onto spaces that don't match the rest of the building's aesthetic or purpose. Government offices in commercial buildings, research laboratories in hotels, medical facilities or holding cells in residential towers, spaces that have clearly been occupied and maintained, but that serve functions completely disconnected from the building's official use. One former security guard described being called to investigate an alarm on what his display showed as floor 13, in a building that supposedly stopped at 12 and resumed at 14. He accessed the elevator override, pressed the unmarked button, and found himself in a corridor lit by different lighting than the rest of the building, fluorescent rather than the warm LED panels used elsewhere. The doors along this corridor had no numbers, only card readers, and through a door that was slightly ajar, he saw a room full of equipment he didn't recognize, servers or computers in configurations that looked medical or scientific, rather than related to any business function he knew the building housed. He reported the anomaly to his supervisor, who told him the floor was owned by a government contractor. Classified operations, not his concern. Never go there again without being specifically instructed. He was assigned to a different building within the month. The pattern repeats across testimonies. Maintenance staff who stumble onto the 13th floor, security personnel who accidentally access it, cleaning crews who are told certain floors are handled by specialized contractors and should never be entered. The spaces they briefly glimpse don't match what the building's public purpose would require. Office buildings contain medical equipment. Hotels have rooms that look like interrogation cells or monitoring stations. Residential buildings house technical infrastructure that suggests surveillance or communications interception far beyond what normal building management would need. And critically, the people working on these hidden floors, when they're encountered, don't engage with the accidental visitors. They don't explain what they're doing or why they're there. They simply ensure the intruder is escorted out and that access is prevented in the future. The theory extends beyond individual buildings to suggest this is systematic infrastructure, that major urban centers have a hidden level running through them, the 13th floors of all major structures, forming a network of concealed spaces that operate parallel to normal city function. Intelligence agencies, black project research, surveillance operations, storage of materials or information that can't be officially acknowledged, all potentially housed in spaces that exist physically but are edited out of official reality through the simple mechanism of declaring that floor number unlucky and omitting it from elevator panels and directory boards. It's hidden in plain sight, protected not by remote locations and armed guards, but by the psychological barrier of a cultural superstition that everyone accepts without questioning. The positioning is strategic. The 13th floor in a 20-story building is roughly 2/3 up, high enough to require elevator access, and far enough from ground level that casual observation from the street won't reveal what's happening inside, but not so high that building services become complicated, or that it's the most expensive real estate in the structure. It's the perfect location for operations that need to be physically present in urban centers, but can't be publicly acknowledged. And because the floor is officially skipped, there's no expectation that it should be accessible. No one questioning why they can't visit it. No tourists or building visitors wondering what's behind those doors, because the building claims those doors don't exist. Consider what could be done with that much concealed space across every major city. In New York alone, hundreds of buildings skip the 13th floor. If even a fraction of those physically existing floors are occupied by classified or clandestine operations, that's hundreds of hidden facilities in a single city, each potentially serving different functions. Surveillance hubs, monitoring communications traffic, storage for materials that can't be kept in official government buildings, meeting spaces for operations that require complete discretion, research laboratories conducting experiments that wouldn't pass ethical review, temporary holding facilities for individuals who can't be processed through normal legal channels. The network would be vast, distributed, and completely invisible to anyone who doesn't have access codes or override keys. The superstition itself might have been engineered or encouraged specifically to create this cover. Triskaidekaphobia existed before the building numbering convention started, but the consistent application of floor skipping across American architecture, beginning in the early 1900s, coincides with the expansion of federal government capabilities and the beginning of organized intelligence services. Was the practice adopted by a construction industry responding to tenant fears, or was it quietly encouraged and standardized to create systematic concealment for operations that required urban presence without public visibility? Once the convention was established, it became self-perpetuating. New buildings skip 13 because existing buildings do, because it's industry standard, because not doing it would be unusual. The original reason, if there was a coordinated effort to create hidden space, gets buried under layers of tradition and assumed superstition. Some researchers have noted that buildings which skip the 13th floor often show anomalies in their elevator timing. The trip from 12 to 14 takes slightly longer than the interval between other floors, suggesting the elevator is traveling the full distance, but the display is manipulated to hide the stop. Passengers don't notice because they're not paying careful attention to duration, and even if they did, slight variations in elevator speed are normal and expected. But careful timing reveals patterns. Elevators in buildings with skipped 13th floors consistently show extra travel time between 12 and 14 compared to the time between other consecutive floors. Is this just the elevator traveling further without stopping because there's no call button for 13? Or is it evidence that the elevator is stopping, that doors are opening, that something is happening during that interval that passengers aren't aware of because the display never shows 13, and their attention is focused on the numbers rather than the physical sensation of movement? There are also reports of elevator malfunctions where the 13th floor briefly appears on displays, moments of technical glitch or override failure where the hidden floor becomes momentarily visible. Passengers describe seeing 13 flash on the elevator panel for a fraction of a second before being replaced by 14, or the elevator doors beginning to open at a floor the panel doesn't acknowledge before closing again and continuing. These glitches are rare enough to be dismissed as minor technical errors, but they're consistent enough across different buildings and different cities to suggest systematic rather than random failure, as if the concealment isn't perfect, and occasionally the true building structure breaks through the official narrative. From a practical perspective, the security benefits of 13th floor concealment are enormous. No visitor logs, because visitors don't know the floor exists. No employees listing it as their workplace, because it's not in the building directory. No deliveries or mail, because there's no official address. The operations conducted there leave no trace in normal building records. No lease agreements filed with the city. No utility usage attributed to that specific floor. Everything is absorbed into the general building overhead, camouflaged by the overall power consumption and space utilization. An investigator trying to track whether something specific is happening in a building would have no reason to look for a floor that official building plans say doesn't exist. The few occasions when 13th floor operations have allegedly been exposed or acknowledged are quickly suppressed or explained away. A news story about government surveillance equipment found in a major urban building gets clarified that it was on the building's mechanical floor, with no mention that mechanical floors usually have their own designation, and that equipment was found in space the building officially doesn't count. Maintenance contracts mention servicing all floors, including mechanical spaces, without specifying which spaces those are, or whether they align with publicly accessible floors. The language is always carefully vague, creating plausible explanations that don't require acknowledging hidden levels. Children sometimes notice the discrepancy that adults have learned to ignore. They ask why the elevator goes from 12 to 14, where the 13th floor is, whether it's really just missing or if it's hidden. Adults give them the standard explanation about superstition, and most children accept this and stop asking. But some remember the question, carry it forward, and later realize that the adult explanation doesn't actually answer the architectural reality. The floor has to exist physically. Buildings don't skip levels structurally just because the buttons don't acknowledge them. The space is there, something occupies it. The question is what and why the answer requires pretending the space doesn't exist, rather than simply acknowledging it, serves purposes that are classified or proprietary. There's psychological conditioning involved in the acceptance of missing 13th floors. We're trained from early age to accept that superstition justifies gaps in logic, that something can officially not exist even though physically it must be present. This creates mental flexibility that extends beyond building numbering. If we accept one convenient fiction without questioning the underlying contradiction, we're more likely to accept other official narratives that don't quite match observable reality. The missing 13th floor becomes practice for accepting cognitive dissonance, for not asking questions about gaps in official explanations, for believing what we're told, even when direct observation suggests something different. In some buildings, the 13th floor is acknowledged but renamed, called the mezzanine, or given a letter designation, or folded into a split-level scheme that obscures the actual floor count. This variation suggests different approaches to the same goal, creating space that exists physically but isn't numbered or designated in a way that maps clearly to the building's apparent structure. You can't go to floor 13 because 13 doesn't exist, and you can't go to mezzanine level M because you don't have authorization. And the fact that mezzanine M happens to be positioned where floor 13 should be is just architectural coincidence, nothing worth examining too carefully. What makes the 13th floor theory particularly unsettling is its mundane plausibility. It doesn't require advanced technology or exotic physics. It's just careful numbering, cultural convention, and willingness to not ask questions about spaces we're told don't need acknowledgement. Every day, millions of people ride elevators through buildings where they travel past a floor they're not allowed to know about, where the elevator might even stop briefly to let someone on or off at a level that doesn't register on the display. And they never notice because they're trusting the numbers rather than paying attention to the physical reality of movement and space. If you're in a tall building right now, there might be a 13th floor directly above or below you. Equipment might be running there, people might be working there, operations might be proceeding there that you'll never learn about because officially that space doesn't exist. The floor isn't hidden in any exotic sense. It's not cloaked or dimensionally shifted. It's just not numbered, not acknowledged, not included in the count that visitors and tenants are shown. And that simple omission, that convenient fiction maintained through architectural convention and cultural superstition, creates perfect cover for activities that require urban presence but can't withstand public awareness. The 13th floor exists in every building that claims to skip it. The question is, what's happening there while everyone below and above goes about their daily business? Riding elevators that travel past secrets concealed not through sophisticated technology, but through nothing more than a missing button and a number that was declared unlucky long ago. Perhaps for reasons that had nothing to do with superstition and everything to do with creating systematic concealment that would persist for generations without anyone thinking to question why a floor that must physically exist is treated as if it simply isn't there.